Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Dale C. Allison Jr. And today's topic is based on his book titled Constructing Jesus, Memory, Imagination, and History. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below and the pinned comment, as well as a link to his course with Derek from Mythvision Podcast. So if you want to purchase the course and the book as well, the links will be in the description below and the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dale.
Happy to be here, Jacob.
And thanks again for joining me. So before we start touching on the apocalyptic material, I want to ask this question out the gate. Can you remind the audience, for anyone tuning in that has no idea what the Q document is, because a lot of my questions will be centering on that. What exactly is the Q source?
So the first thing I have to emphasize is that the Q source is a hypothesis. So there are many New Testament scholars who think that there's a literary relationship between the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And for those of us who think that Mark was first, that is, Matthew and Luke know Mark and they are using it as a source, it's very common to believe that they had access to another source, a source that is now lost, like many, or I guess most, documents from antiquity. And this source is called Q. Probably comes from some German in the 19th century, an abbreviation for Quella, which means source. And it is thought of as primarily a collection of sayings of Jesus. And by the way, proponents of Q were very happy when the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in the 40s and published in the 50s, because it showed that there actually was such a thing in early Christianity as a collection of sayings of Jesus. So that's basically what it is. There are a couple of stories in there also, most famously the temptation narrative in its long form in Matthew and Luke. But I do want to emphasize one thing. There are very intelligent, well-informed people who doubt the Q hypothesis. Mark Goodacre at Duke is one. Francis Watson at the University of Durham is another. They're very smart people, and I'm not happy that they disagree with me on this. On the other hand, let me also say that I started many years ago work on a commentary on Matthew, and I was looking forward to it, among other things, because I thought it would give me the opportunity not to just believe what my teachers had taught me about the sources of the synoptics or the solution to the so-called synoptic problem, but it would allow me to look at every single verse in Matthew and every single parallel in Luke and every single parallel in Mark. And I ended up sort of disappointed because I ended up being very conventional. I decided Mark was first and that the Q hypothesis was still the best hypothesis. And I'm of that opinion also today. I actually wrote an article fairly recently defending Q once more. So I'll be presupposing that Q exists today, and many scholars believe in this, but everybody needs to know it is a hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis even though we have a critical edition of Q, which appeared, I guess, a little over 20 years now. There was a group of scholars, very serious scholars, who looked at the sayings common to Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark, and they tried to figure out on the basis of word statistics and so on, redactional tendencies, what the wording of the source behind Matthew and Luke would have looked like. And we have a critical edition of a text that doesn't exist. So that's a really interesting and a bit of an odd situation.
Did Jesus, between the Baptists and the first Christians, all agree on the eschatology, or did they have different views of it?
So is it? Oh, okay. So maybe here you're thinking of one of the arguments in my book. So my book argues that Jesus was an eschatological prophet and was a proponent of what you can call apocalyptic eschatology. And one of the arguments in the book is that Jesus is between, chronologically, John the Baptist and the earliest Christian sources we have, which are Paul's letters. And Paul, especially in First Thessalonians, which is the earliest piece of Christian literature we have, clearly thinks that the end is near, and he has an apocalyptic scenario about Jesus returning on the clouds and the resurrection of the dead. That's the first thing we have after Jesus, and this is from somebody who thinks he's following Jesus. He's an adherent of the faith that connects itself to Jesus. And before Jesus, we have John the Baptist. Now, we don't have a lot about John the Baptist, and what we have is mostly in Christian sources. There's a little passage in Josephus, but the words attributed to Jesus, to John the Baptist in Matthew, Mark, and Luke make him sound like an apocalyptic prophet. He's expecting a coming one. He says the axe is already at the root of the tree, and he speaks of fire. So Jesus is between John and Paul, and the Gospels contain sayings which praise John the Baptist, and Jesus submitted to the baptism of John the Baptist. And that means that one would think that he agreed with him about a number of things. So this argument says that unless there are really good reasons to the contrary, it's a good guess that Jesus, being between John and Paul and admiring John and being admired by Paul, probably has the same sort of outlook. And for me, that outlook would involve a belief in the coming judgment and God making the world right in a very radical way. So I think that's probably what your question was trying to get at there.
Yeah, it was. When exactly was Jesus expected to return? You just mentioned that Paul thinks it's going to happen soon in his lifetime. So are we to understand that this is supposed to have happened in the first century?
So we don't have in early Christianity what we have with, let's say, William Miller in the 19th century in the United States, where you actually pick a date and Jesus will return on that date. So you never have the problem of that date rolling around. There was a California evangelist also in fairly recent times who picked a date. It didn't happen. Picked another date. It didn't happen. And eventually he was discredited. But you can't have that in early Christianity because you do not have a date. So what you have are things such as this generation will not pass away before, or there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God has come with power. So it's a near expectation, but it doesn't come with a date. And given that this is a pretty robust religious movement, it can continue and just sort of say, I think for several decades, Jesus will come back soon. Jesus will come back soon. It's only maybe with the Gospel of John that you get a complete separation between the first and second advents, if I may put it that way, so that they are two separate events. And you no longer think of inaugurated eschatology or eschatology in the process of realization. For John, there's the time of Jesus, and then there's the time of the church, and then there's the time of the judgment and the resurrection. But John nowhere says that is near. So I think for the first few decades, and I think following John the Baptist and Jesus, there was a near expectation. By the way, the Gospel of Luke says clearly in Luke 19, I think it's verse 11, that when the disciples went up to Jerusalem, they expected the kingdom of God to come immediately. And in the book of Acts, in chapter 1, the author says, the disciples asked, well, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? In chapter 3, in Peter's speech, there's a quotation from an Old Testament prophet, And inserted into it is in these last days. In chapter 3, Peter calls for repentance so that times of refreshing may come and that God might send the Messiah. So I don't think Luke, apart from the details of his accounts here, I don't think Luke is making this up. I think he remembers that at the beginning, people hoped, Jesus' followers hoped that the end was near. And I think that the obvious reason for that is that Jesus himself hoped that the end was near. He was their teacher. If he was anything, he was a teacher. And they got many of their ideas from him. So no date, but a genuine near expectation, which again, you can see all through Paul. By the time you get to Philippians, Paul realizes that maybe he'll die before it happens. But the Thessalonians, after Paul left, appear to have thought that the end was so near that they didn't expect anyone would die in the meantime. And when somebody dies, then they've got questions for Paul. So that shows a great a very serious near expectation. And by the way, I'd also add that in the Gospels, even when you don't have time-stamped statements, you have lots of statements about judgment and the Son of Man and things that you think of as belonging to the latter days. And usually, typically, when people speak that much about the last things, it's because they think that they're probably near.
So now I want to ask you about the Gospel of Mark. So you just mentioned that it talks about some of you will not taste death before you see the Son of Man returning.
Uh-huh.
So my question to you is did they conceive that as having happened in some kind of way, or is it a failed prophecy since the temple was destroyed and the Son of Man did not come down?
Okay. So you're asking from our point of view or their point of view? If you're asking from their point of view, I don't know anybody that says no, this was a falsified prophecy. But you do have the really interesting ending in John's Gospel, chapter 21, where Peter is having a conversation with the risen Jesus, and he says, "What about this guy?" And what you learn is that there were some people who thought that the beloved disciple, whoever he is, the beloved disciple would not die before Jesus returned. It's obvious, given the gist of this conversation, that he has died. So the people who passed on this word that's being responded to in John 21 clearly thought, oh, we thought Jesus would return before this guy died, and Jesus hasn't. So from their point of view, there must be some sort of crisis. The evangelist says, no, that's not what's going on here. So there must have been things like that going on. But I don't think there was at any point a great crisis. I'm not on board with those who think that, let's say, Mark 13 and Matthew 24, Luke 21 are really about AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem, and all the prophecies were then happily fulfilled in the first century. I don't think that's what's going on. I actually think what's happening is that the apocalyptic events are, in these discourses, beginning with Mark 13, closely tied together. And I do think it was probably disillusioning to some, or concerning to some, that you had the fall of the temple, you had the Jewish war, and still the Son of Man didn't come. That must have been discouraging for some, or unexpected for some. And again, I think that's probably one of the impulses that leads to something like the Gospel of John, where you still have statements about judgment and resurrection, but they're nowhere said to be at hand, and the disciples aren't being exhorted to watch because Jesus could return at any minute. So there, it's hard to maintain the same sort of enthusiasm, religious enthusiasm about the coming of Jesus or the events being very, very near over decade after decade after decade. I know some people, some friends of mine who were called Jesus people in the early 1970s, and they all thought Jesus was coming back soon. Some of them are still going to church, but they no longer think Jesus is coming back soon. They think he will come back someday, but they have lost over the decades the sense of imminence. And I think that happens to many in the early church.
So what you're saying is that rather than looking at it as a failed prophecy, it's not as tied to destruction of the temple as others made it out to be?
Well, I'll have to think about that. I think that whoever writes Mark and that whoever writes Matthew, I've never been quite sure what's going on with Luke, so I'll just leave Luke aside. But I do think that the author of Mark, who is writing shortly before the destruction or immediately afterwards, and Matthew, who's writing afterwards, I think they thought of the events in their chapters in Mark 13 and Matthew 24 as taking place as the same series of events. They didn't think like modern Christians think of the destruction of Jerusalem as back there and then the second coming up there down the road in the future. They think that they should be or will be closely tied, and they simply aren't. So from their point of view, no, that's not what I want to say. From our point of view, from my point of view, I think that their expectations about the destruction of Jerusalem were fulfilled, but their expectations about the coming of the Son of Man were not. So I don't read Mark 13 or Matthew 24 as sort of describing one cluster of events at a particular time and another cluster of events down the road. I think they all belong together for Matthew and Mark, but history then came and split them.
How would you look at 2 Thessalonians then? Is it reworking Paul's, and how is it reworking Paul's eschatology in 1 Thessalonians?
So I have to be honest here and say that for most of my career, I assumed that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. I am no longer sure of that. I think it might have been put on the end of an early Pauline collection. But the issue of harmony with 1 Thessalonians or between 1 and 2 Thessalonians, I don't know what to say about that. You have the figure of whatever it is, the Antichrist, and it's already the spirit, is already at work. The spirit of lawlessness. I actually think that harmonizes with Paul, but if 2 Thessalonians is not written by Paul, then it's written by somebody who isn't wildly different in his outlook, in my judgment, than Paul is. And of course, there have been really good scholars who have defended the view that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, Robert Jewett, Ernest Best, Abraham Malherbe. So I'm just not sure that's something I've been thinking about or rethinking lately.
So did eschatology in Christianity change at all after the destruction of the temple?
So, yeah, I think this will repeat in part what I said earlier. So you can look forward to the judgment and to the return of the Son of Man and to everything being fixed to some kind of millennial kingdom and ultimately heaven and hell. And think of those things as down the road. They may happen in your lifetime, they may not. Or you can believe in all those things and think that they are very near. So I think before AD 70, it's a fairly good generalization that lots and lots of Christians, I would say most, thought that all of this was near to hand. They had no sense that things would go on and continue as they are for centuries. Paul doesn't expect this. The writers of the Gospels do not expect it. The author of Revelation does not expect this. So what happens is you retain the same beliefs. They are just not existentially impinging upon you as they were earlier. It's sort of like the earliest Christians think that the world is dying, and that and then the later Christians, it might go on for a while. It's sort of like this. So if I tell you that you only have 6 weeks to live, you will then feel your death in a way that you won't if the doctor says you've got another 40 years, you're in perfect health, nothing to worry about. You may still have the same end in mind, you're going to die, but it's not going to impinge upon you and formulate your ideas and your feelings the way it will if that end is near. I think the end was near for John the Baptist, for Jesus, for Paul, for the authors of Mark and Matthew. I do not think it's there for the Gospel of John. And then you get it off and on always through Christian history because you can revive the sense of nearness. But the mainstream church pretty much goes on its way without worrying about Jesus coming soon. So yeah, from that point of view, there is a difference. Unlike some scholars, I don't think I would speak of the crisis of the delay of the parousia. I think that, or the delay of the second coming, I think it's just something that happens gradually and slowly, and religions are very adaptable, and people can make the appropriate changes, and you can go from thinking this is coming soon to, well, it may not be so soon after all.
So in a way, it's kind of unfalsifiable. It can always change gradually and therefore never be completely understood as a false prophecy, as a failed prophecy.
Well, people within religions rarely do that. So the typical thing that happens in millenarian movements is that if you have a prophecy that isn't fulfilled in the ways that are expected, you come up with an explanation or a rationalization. One thing you can do is spiritualize things. Say, well, we thought it was going to be a literal coming, but it was, a coming in heaven, the sort of thing that was done with Seventh-day Adventist thinking in the 19th century. You can explain delay through human sin. When Sabbatai Tzvi, back there in the 17th century, the Jewish Messiah, did not redeem the world and become what his followers expected, there were some who said, things didn't work out because we didn't repent accurately. There was actually one person who said that we performed the liturgies incorrectly, and that's why things didn't happen. So contingent eschatology can become an apologetic, a way of saying, well, it was near, but because certain conditions failed, the end did not come. So I if you have a date and you say certain things are going to happen on that date, then to outsiders, you would say, yeah, that's been falsified. But insiders, again, are very good at I guess you would call them rationalizations. But you also have to add that most groups, when they have a date, that's not what they're all about. That is, they may look forward to a date, but there are sociological and psychological factors that make them want to belong to this group and make them want this group to continue. And I think is fairly rare for a group to have a date. It does happen, but it's fairly rare for a group just to say we're all disillusioned and we're going home.
Can you tell us about the parallels between Q and Mark 13?
Oh, between, in particular, oh gosh, off the top of my head, I don't know what the parallels between Q and Mark 13 would be. The parallels between Q and Mark 13 would be more thematic, would be things like judgment or conflict within families. There certainly is that there.
That's what I was asking about.
Yeah, well, there is some overlap there, but you probably don't have, well, okay, I don't know. So here's what most people who believe in Q would say. They would say it's distinguished from Mark in that there are no terminal sayings. That is, they would say Q has nothing like Mark 13:30, which is all these things will happen before this generation will pass away. You also have Mark 9:1, which is a statement. Certain things are going to happen really, really soon. The one terminal statement in the Gospels that's outside of Mark is Matthew 10:23. So you will not have gone through all the tribes of Israel before the Son of Man comes. That's usually assigned to what's called M, that is tradition that only Matthew knows. But it occurs in his missionary discourse, which is influenced, I think, by the Q source. And commentators down through the centuries are always troubled by this saying, and they have trouble figuring it out. Albert Schweitzer made it the key to his whole reconstruction of Jesus. It shows that Jesus really did think the end was near when he sent out his disciples. In any case, if that were in Q, if Q existed and that were in Q, I am pretty sure Luke would have gotten rid of it. So it's possible for me, I've actually argued this, is possible that Matthew 10:23 belonged in Q or was part of Q. In that case, you would have another overlap between Mark and Q if you assign Matthew 10:23 to Q.
So I want to take a couple of super chats real quick.
Okay.
Let me see. Oh, there it is. We'll start with Derek's. Derek from Efficient Podcast, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Allison, have you changed your position to conditional expectations with Jesus or Paul? What kind of end was expected in the New Testament in the first century?
Okay, so those are two different questions. I haven't changed my mind at all about what end was expected. And I don't think I've changed my mind at all about Paul. What I have done in a new book, and I just got my copy yesterday, so I don't think anybody has seen it except the press and me. What I have argued is that, not with certainty, but as a decent hypothesis, is that Jesus may have hoped for a really near end, and then at some point, for reasons we don't need to go into here, thought, oh, before the end winds up, I'm probably going to be killed, and there's probably going to be some space between my death and the wrapping up of everything. So that's what I argue in the new book. It's not annulling imminent expectation from Jesus. It's simply hypothesizing that at the end of his life, and I don't know if this means the last few weeks, maybe so, uh, towards the end of his life, that he begins to reckon with the real possibility of execution and death, and therefore that has to happen before everything else plays out. I think, against many of my fellow scholars, that Jesus, if he uttered something like Mark 9:1, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come, that he could have included himself, that he might have hoped himself to be one of those. If so, then I think at the end he decided, no, I'm not. That doesn't change what he expected down the road, but it does put a bit of a space between that, between his own experience and the future, which he may not have lived with before. I tend to think that at some point in his ministry, Jesus was probably like the Paul who preached to the Thessalonians, so that the end is very near and it could come at any time, and everybody needs to watch. If so, I think there's a little added space at the end.
And Derek, thank you for your number super chat. How far, Dr. Allison? Weeks, months, years, millennia?
How far? Now, is that question about Jesus? Or is it about me?
I think he means Jesus.
Yeah, okay, all right, fine. So I don't think we have access to this information. There's a scholar named Tucker Furda who has a great new book out on the second coming, and he thinks I'm wrong here. He thinks Jesus, throughout his ministry, operated with the notion that these events will happen in this generation. I think that Jesus probably operated with something more eminent than that. So if you want to ask weeks or months, I don't know how to decide that. It's just a sense that things are very near, and then maybe that's different from the end where, I'm going to die and some other things are going to happen before it all winds up. So weeks, that's thinkable to me. Months, that's thinkable to me. Years, I doubt that. Millennia, I doubt that.
Michael E., thank you for your super chat. In Mark 14:51-52, a young man flees naked during Jesus' arrest. What is the significance of this event, symbolic or literal, in the gospel narrative?
Yeah. Okay. I have no idea. That's the honest answer. I don't think it's the author's autograph. Some people have thought that. I don't think, I haven't been convinced that it's to be connected with the young man in Mark 16, and it has something to do with baptismal garment and so on. I don't know. It's a very strange passage. The other evangelists don't have it. I think Matthew looked at it and said, what the heck is that? So he doesn't reproduce it. Some people have thought maybe it's part of Mark's idea of prophetic fulfillment. There's a passage in Amos, something like mighty men will run naked in those days. I don't recall it exactly, but it's in Amos, and it's about people fleeing naked. So it's possible that this is intended to be another item of prophetic fulfillment. But I have to be honest and said, I've never read an article on this, and tons have been written, and it's fun to think about. I've never read anything that made me think, yeah, that's got to be it. Every time I've read an article on this, I've just thought, I'm still looking for the right answer. So I think that's great. I think it's great to have things that haven't been solved yet, or at least I haven't solved them to my satisfaction. So I'm disappointed. I hate to disappoint, but I don't know the answer.
All right, we'll come back to super chats in a little bit. I now want to continue asking about the relationship between Q and Mark. What do you make of the Q and Mark parallels in general? Do they reflect evidence that Mark knows Q, or do they share a common source instead?
Yeah, so I used to think throughout most of my career that they probably reflected a common source. And that source actually could be very early tradition going back to Jesus. A friend of mine, Benedict Viviano, wrote an article, maybe 25 years ago. Um, and he argued that the place to start the quest should be the agreement between Mark and Q. So there are, if you believe in Q, there are certain overlaps. These overlaps include sayings, like the saying about salt, but also overlaps of paragraphs or passages. So the usual idea, if Q existed, is that Mark had a missionary discourse in Mark 6, and Q also had a missionary discourse, and there's some overlap between them. Matthew in chapter 10 then combines Mark with Q, and then Luke in chapters 9 and 10 actually has two missionary discourses, and the traditional conventional thought is that the missionary discourse in Luke 9 is mostly from Mark 6, and the one in 10 is from Q mostly. So you have a doublet in the tradition. And then you look at what is common to Mark and Q, and that takes you back to an earlier stage of the tradition. That might be the right way to do this. However, I have, within the last 10 years or so, began to wonder whether Mark and Q are independent. This is part of a larger problem that I've been wrestling with for a while. I used to assume that all these sources are independent. I'm now wondering whether that's true. I used to think John was independent of the Synoptics. I no longer do that. I wonder if Mark has seen a copy of Q at some point or heard Q recited or something like that. So I'm not sure that these are independent. If they are, and you're oriented towards source criticism, as the late Ben Viviano was, then that's really, really important. But if you begin to doubt that Q and Mark are independent, then it doesn't do much for you.
And so now I want to ask you about the Thomas and Matthew 13 parallels. Does Thomas and Matthew 13 construe the same parables like Jesus' aphorisms differently?
Oh, definitely. So my take on Q is that of many. That's the view, for example, of April DeConnick. I think that Q is de-eschatologizing parts of the tradition. So if you look at the parable of the fish, where in Matthew it's the last judgment, and the angels are sorting the fishes, the good and the bad, is very different in Thomas, and the eschatological orientation is gone. This was one of my disagreements back in the day when I was in dialogue with certain members of the Jesus seminar, and they were using Thomas as a primary source. One of my arguments was that if you look at the overlaps between Matthew and Thomas, Thomas doesn't have the eschatology. But if you look at the overlaps between Mark and Thomas, Thomas. It doesn't have the eschatology. And if you look at the overlaps between Thomas and just about everything, Thomas has de-eschatologized the tradition. So I don't think of Thomas as a primary source. I think of it as a rolling text, as DeConnick did, and I think it is an illustration of what I said earlier, how you can reinterpret a tradition or spiritualize a tradition. And I think Thomas is moving away from the original eschatological focus of the earlier tradition, which Matthew still has.
So when you say the text is rolling, a rolling text, does that mean that parts of it were written and added to over a long period of time?
Yes. So I think you could probably call Isaiah a rolling text, to draw an analogy. So the scholars tend to say that Isaiah developed in stages, and they'll speak of first Isaiah and second Isaiah and third Isaiah. So you have first Isaiah, which has oracles from the original Isaiah, but things that are added to. And then you have second Isaiah, which is then tacked on. And then you have third Isaiah, which is also tacked on. So the text grew over time. You might even think of Matthew as a revised version of Mark. Now, DeConnick can sort of uncover the details. I'm not so sure about that, but I think that Q represents traditions that were passed on, probably orally, and at some point they're written and then they get revised. And so what you have is a tradition that's being added to and that's being reinterpreted with time. At what point exactly it's written, I don't know. But I would view Thomas as a sort, as it stands now, as a redactional product of a tradition that has been in process for a time. And one of the things DeConnick does is observe that there are traces of an apocalyptic tradition here, which seem to have been rewritten or revised or reinterpreted. I think this is, to some extent, like the Gospel of John, because it's familiar with the apocalyptic traditions in the early church. It knows about judgment and resurrection, but its focus is to spiritualize them and bring them into the present. So things that are down the road in the Synoptics become present in the Gospel of John. Again, a sort of a spiritualizing, which is what you would expect, and I sympathize with it as time goes on, because you can't live with imminence forever.
Do you see apocalyptic elements slipping into the text of Thomas, and despite the redactional stages and that de-eschatologize the tradition, like the part where it has Jesus saying that the earth will be set ablaze?
Yeah, there are some places that sound like they still are apocalyptic, but I doubt that the author is thinking of fire in the same way that John the Baptist was. I may be wrong, but given the tendencies I see everywhere else in the document, I think that these sorts of things are being reinterpreted. So again, Thomas for me is a second century text. It may well go back to a first century text, but I think the first century text would have looked very different, because what has happened is we've had additions and revisions of the thing. Again, kind of like the Gospel of John. So if you go through the Gospel of John very carefully, you can find overlaps with the Synoptics at various places, or echoes of sayings that you have in the Synoptics. But these have been revised and reinterpreted, and then obviously greatly expanded. So a bit of an analogy there.
So now I want to ask you about the historical Jesus and the stages of Q, and the opinion of some in terms of dismissing the apocalyptic Jesus.
Well, so probably what you're referring to is what some scholars have done with John Kloppenborg's three-stage
It is.
idea of Q. Uh, John was very successful in persuading a lot of people that you have a sort of original wisdom document. And by the way, his understanding of a Q would make it something like a rolling document, so that you originally have um, this wisdom aphoristic stage, which is not focused on eschatology. And then you get a second phase where you have all the judgment sayings. And then the third step for him is adding the temptation of Jesus in Q4. Um, I'm not on board with this. I'm not opposed, even though many scholars um, think this is going too far. I'm not opposed to thinking about Q in stages, and I uh, worked up my own theory about how Q might have evolved over time. Uh, John was much more successful in getting people to buy into his idea than mine. But your question then becomes, if the original stage has less eschatology or doesn't have all these statements about judgment, then doesn't that show that the judgment statements come from a second stage in early Christianity? John himself did not argue this. John said that the secondary stage or saints could go back to Jesus, or some of them could go back to Jesus. Just because they're added at a secondary stage doesn't tell you where they come from. Q's literary history isn't the same as figuring out what Jesus of Nazareth was like. I think he's right about that. But my own reconstruction of Q took a very different turn. I was very influenced by Gerd Thyssen's work on itinerants. I still think he was basically correct. I think the first stage of Q looks like material that would have spoken directly to itinerant prophets, to people going around as they are in the Didache and preaching, or as they are in the Gospels, or the disciples are in the Gospels. I then think there's a second stage and then a third stage. But you can't equate literary history with reconstructing the historical Jesus. That doesn't make sense. Everybody recognizes that there are historical elements that don't appear, let's say, in Q, but that are in Mark. So Q is earlier than Mark, but Q says nothing about the crucifixion, not in any straightforward way. There's no mention of Pilate. There's no mention of all sorts of things that we tend to think of as historical. So you can't just take Q and say it's the earliest, so everything that is after that has to be fiction. And it's the same thing within Q itself. You can't just say, oh, this is the earliest layer and everything else must be fiction. That's just not how it works. That's too simple, and it overlooks the literary strategy or the purpose of the collection. And no collection anywhere is simply gathering everything that the author knows or believes. That's not the case. When people write texts or produce texts, they have goals in mind, and that directs their decisions as to what to include and exclude. And they are always excluding stuff. Nobody is just saying this text is absolutely everything I've ever heard on this subject. That's not how it works.
So, in other words, when you look at Q as a rolling text, for instance, and it's adding material over time, that new additional material doesn't automatically get declared fiction. It's just it could be pulling historical truth about
Sure.
Jesus and
Sure,
adding
heck,
to
heck.
an
I mean,
existing
you can
text.
at least in theory. I'm not saying this is what happened, but you can imagine in theory somebody running across a text and saying, this is wrong about some things, so I'm going to correct it, and the corrector could be correct. All right, so that's not what I think is going on in Q, but just hypothetically, the earliest account of something doesn't exhaust the historical quest. Uh, that would be like saying, I don't know, the first biography of Abraham Lincoln is the only one we should consult because it's the earliest. That doesn't make any sense.
What do the sources say about the eschatological teachings of Jesus having been misunderstood?
Well, so there's nothing like that in Q, but that is there in John, and it's in Luke. I mentioned Luke 19:11 earlier, and then it's also in Mark. My own view is that this is an apologetical. This is two things. So first of all, it's just the case in worldwide literature. I discovered this ages ago for the first time when I read the Analects of Confucius. And I noticed that the disciples were sometimes misunderstanding what Confucius was saying. And it was a literary motif, a way for Confucius to elaborate further on what he was saying. So the wise teacher says something, then the disciples misunderstand, and then the wise person gets to clarify further. So some of that's going on in Mark, but I also think that this motif can function apologetically to say, well, the disciples may have thought this, but Jesus didn't. So with regard to a near end, for example, scholars who do not want to attribute a near expectation to Jesus have often, I've documented this, have often said, well, the disciples misunderstood everything and I understand it better. And so they thought Jesus was talking about a near end when he wasn't. But I think that's very strange. The disciples hung around Jesus. They paid attention to Jesus. He was their teacher. They must have got their ideas from Jesus. I don't think they're misunderstanding something as basic as that. So Luke seems to imply that they are. John is saying people misunderstood in chapter 2. In chapter 21, people misunderstood. I'm skeptical of those sorts of explanations.
Is Jesus compared to Moses via interpreting Deuteronomy regarding a prophet like Moses?
Yes, well, there's no doubt about that. So that happens in Acts 3, and it happens in Acts 7 in a couple of speeches. And by the way, if there are sources for the speeches in Acts, chapters 3 and 7 are the best candidates. So that in itself is as interesting. The story of the Transfiguration seems to me in its origin, not just in its current forms in the Synoptics, a way of saying Jesus was like Moses. Moses went up on Sinai and met God there. Elijah went up on Sinai on the mountain, and there was a theophany there. Both met God on the mountain, and Jesus then is on the mountain. God comes down in a cloud. God speaks from the cloud. Jesus glows. This is a replay. So wherever that story comes from, it's functioning within Mark's tradition as a way of saying Jesus is like Moses. And this then gets picked up, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, where you have an extensive Moses typology through the first 7 chapters. So when Jesus is born, there's a wicked king on the throne. He slaughters Jewish infants. The hero goes down into the waters. He goes out into the desert. He's tempted by hunger. He's tempted by idolatry. He's there for 40 days and nights instead of 40 years. He goes up on a mountain. He gives his commandments. He sets them over against Moses. Then he comes down from the mountain. The whole thing is an extensive typology. But, and here you need to know that I'm in the minority, because it's been really, really common among New Testament scholars, Bultmann and his school, but many others, to say that Jesus thought of himself as an eschatological prophet. I think that's correct, but I don't think that's quite right, because I personally think we have enough evidence to say that Jesus thought of himself as fulfilling the role of the prophet like Moses. You mentioned Deuteronomy 18. That is an expectation in pre-Christian Judaism, as we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Gospels present it. I think they take it for granted. For John 6, for example, Jesus feeds the multitude, and everybody says, "Oh, must be the prophet who is to come into the world." The commentators, beginning with Origen, say, "Oh, yeah, this is Deuteronomy 18." So this is there, but I think Jesus himself, it's not just a literary motif. I think it has its birth or beginning in Jesus. In Luke, Jesus says, "If I cast out demons by the finger of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." The finger of God is an expression drawn from Exodus, and it's not about God writing the Ten Commandments on the stones. It's about Moses doing his miracles by the finger of God. And at the Last Supper, there is a reference to the blood of the covenant, which is a phrase that comes out of Exodus. Again, it's associated with Moses. It's only used one other time in the Hebrew Bible, which is at the end of Zechariah, which is picking up what was said by Moses. So you have things like this that add up. Jesus is constantly talking about this generation in a disparaging way. And if you look at the phraseology, a lot of those phrases have parallels in the Pentateuch describing the generation of Moses. Moses picks 12 people to help him, to assist him in his work. Jesus does the same. So without knowing exactly what Jesus said, or did, or being able to establish this through criteria of dissimilarity or whatever. I have in my most recent book set forth all these places where Jesus is like Moses, and a number of them are in sayings attributed to him. And I think the evidence suffices to say that he thought of himself in these terms. We know of the so-called sign prophets from Josephus in the first century, that others sought to repay the salvific past. And we also just know from history, even modern history, that it's not uncommon for people to live into typologies. One of my favorites is that Alexander the Great wanted to be like Achilles, and Julius Caesar wanted to be like Alexander, and Napoleon wanted to be like Caesar, and General Santa Anna wanted to be like Napoleon. Simeon Stylites, the guy who is the pillar sitter and so strange. If you look at the sources, they have Moses typologies, but it's also clear that he himself went up on a mountain and tried to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And he's trying to be like Moses. In our own day, Martin Luther King, his famous speech, "I've been to the mountain, I've seen the promised land, I may not get there with you." He's being like Moses. Anyway, it's not weird or strange for people to live into typologies. Of course, they have various different reasons for their Moses typologies, but I think it's a really good bet that Jesus didn't just think of himself as some sort of generic eschatological prophet, which is probably a strange idea in Judaism anyway. The Gospels always want to identify: are you the Messiah? Are you Jeremiah? Are you John the Baptist? I doubt that he was completely vague about this matter.
What is the function of the resurrection?
The resurrection doesn't have one function. It has multiple functions. I suppose its chief function originally is to serve as vindication for Jesus, which means vindication for his followers. And so they continue the cause which they were already supporting before Easter. Of course, they do other things with it. They end up with the notion of an ascension. They end up with the notion of Jesus at the right hand. But I think originally it's a vindication of the pre-Easter Jesus and of their ideas that they developed while following him around and while listening to him. So that's its function, or that's its first major function.
How popular was the apocalyptic eschatology in the first century?
Well, we don't have, sociological surveys. We don't have that kind of data. We have letters from leaders. But I think it was probably common coin among the early Christians. Um, I think you can see it behind Acts, which is written post 70. It's obvious in all three Gospels. I think John is revising it, editing it. So I don't know if you want to use the term mainstream because there's a lot of diversity among groups in all times and places, right? But I think I would say it's part of the dominant ideology, if you can use those sorts of terms. Now, if Paul is in Ephesus and he converts some people, do some of them say, well, I like this A, B, and C, but this, this near end stuff I don't buy? Well, maybe so. If so, I couldn't tell you who they were or how many of them there were. But it seems to me that the authors that we have and the leaders that we know about were all agreed on this. Paul thinks this. Peter reflects this in Acts. All three synoptics reflect this. The Epistle of James, which I don't think was written by James, but it picks up or plays on ideas or traditions about him, images of him, social memory of him, and it's got a near end also in it. Revelation, whoever that John is, also has a near end. So it seems to me that there's an awful lot of this early on. And even if the people in the 4th century who are, finally deciding what exactly goes in what ends up being called the New Testament, those people aren't thinking that the end is near, but they're putting together a collection of books in which this is an important idea. So I personally don't see how you get around this.
Who is the coming one that John the Baptist talked about?
Well, look, if you read the commentaries, they give different answers. So, especially in German scholarship, one answer has been God. Some people have thought maybe he was talking about Elijah, and Jesus was originally Elijah, and then that gets moved back to Jesus later on. Others have thought it must be the Messiah, others the Son of Man. I don't know that it's wise to bet on this because John the Baptist is a person that we know little about. At the very best, we have just a handful of sentences from him. So the early Christians are hearing this and they're thinking that it refers to Jesus. So if you want, you can say it's more likely than not that they saw some relevance in this prophecy, and they knew something about John the Baptist. They knew enough to have these traditions about him that they thought that it could refer to a messianic figure. So I guess I would say a messianic figure of some sort, whether he was thinking of Elijah or thinking of the Son of Man, maybe had an idea about Christos or Mashiach or the Messiah, a Davidic Messiah. I don't think that we have enough information to know. I would, if I had to bet, say I think the God thing is probably wrong, is some sort of Jewish Redeemer figure, but those take all shapes in the literature. So I can't pin that down.
What did Jesus expect in his eschatological teachings? What did he think about the world to come and the kingdom?
Well, so I think that he thinks of something sort of between a millenarian, very earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom. I've expressed it as something like heaven come down to earth. So it's a sort of complete remaking of the world. It's the sort of image you get in Second Baruch, or maybe in Papias or Justin Martyr, the second century Christians who believe in a millennium. He believes in judgment. He believes in some sort of dualism, by which I mean some people flunk the judgment while other people pass it. He believes in resurrection. He believes in some sort of intermediary between God and what's going on. Somebody like the figure in First Enoch, or somebody like Melchizedek in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know what more I could say with that. It's a view of radical transformation. I disagree here, for example, with John Dominic Crossan. I think that Jesus sees divine intervention in a way Crossan doesn't. I think it's a supernatural remaking of the world, the sort of thing that comes with resurrection of the dead, which means the resurrection of the dead. I don't think it's a metaphor in the Synoptics. It becomes a metaphor in the Gospel of John and in Colossians and Ephesians. You've been raised with Christ and so on. But I think in the Synoptics, it's the end of the world, grave stuff.
What is the Didache? And can you tell us about Matthew and Luke's agreements against it, or some of their agreements against it?
Well, the most famous one is the account of the Lord's Prayer. So the Didache is a really interesting text. It also is a rolling text, or at least it's gone through 2 editions, maybe more. I think it's possible that an early edition comes from the 1st century. I think it contains very old traditions, but it has been revised or updated in the 2nd century. One of the most interesting things about it is that it has a version of the Lord's Prayer. And it, if I recall off the top of my head, it agrees with Matthew word for word against Luke. Luke has a slightly different version, and Luke's version is a bit shorter. Matthew's is a bit elaborated, probably by the evangelist himself. I think it agrees, the Didache agrees with Matthew in everything but the address. And I think, I'd have to check this. I don't know if the Didache is Father or Our Father, but it's not Our Father who art in heaven, which is what you have in Matthew. So the Didache, in my view, probably in its current form, shows a knowledge of the Gospel of Matthew, but it's a very difficult text, because if you're thinking in terms of Jesus tradition, because I think at points it has independent tradition, at points independent of the Synoptics, but at points I also think it knows Matthew.
What did Q's Jesus say about measuring?
Wow, that's just the saying that's in Matthew 7. It's also in Luke, with the measure you measure, it will be measured to you. I think myself that is a saying in Q about judgment, which is the way Matthew interprets it. But it is one of those sayings that if Jesus uttered it, he's borrowing it, because you can find rabbinic sayings which are just mirror images of this, and it can be used in different contexts. Part of the problem here with our discipline in the post-form critical era is that we tend to think that the evangelists are taking sayings when they're isolated and then putting them into context, but context generates meaning. So if you just have this aphorism by itself and you don't know the original context, and you doubt, for example, the Sermon on the Mount is the original context, then it's very difficult to figure out what Jesus might have intended by it. But it is also attested as a saying in rabbinic sources, and I don't think they're borrowing from the Christians, they're borrowing from the gospel. So there's a case where the Jesus tradition or Jesus himself is picking up a traditional saying and then using it for its own ends. But I can't tell you for sure what Jesus intended. I think the best bet is to look at Matthew's context, and it has to do with judgment. You judge, watch out, you're going to be judged also. Very much the same thing as the log in the eye and looking at another person's speck in the eye and being a hypocrite. In Gospels, I think it goes back to Leviticus 19, where you are commanded to judge your neighbor. And Jesus in the gospel said, no, you're not supposed to do that. I think he is saying this within an eschatological worldview. But there are differences of opinion here, as always.
Does the Didache contain parallels to Q?
Yes, it does, especially in the first chapter. But again, these are really hard to sort out. I have spent some time and written about them. If you want to think that the Didache knew Q, it's possible. But one of the things I've noticed is that there are some structural similarities between certain sayings in Luke and the Didache and Matthew. There are certain patterns, and the patterns are consistent. They especially like these groups of fours, but this varies from text to text. And if I had to bet, I think that something like the Sermon on the Plain circulated in the early church. And it's not just something that's in Luke 6 and then expanded in Matthew. I think it's something known to First Clement and the Didache, and maybe even Polycarp. So, and I think Paul probably knew this. Anyway, the sayings that are collected in Luke 6 do have parallels in the Didache, and I'm inclined to think that the Didache may not just be reading or influenced by Mark or Matthew and Luke, but may have some sort of independent access to this tradition that shows up in the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount.
Can you tell us about Q's Jesus opposing retaliation?
Well, I'm not sure what you want to hear here. And I'm not sure what you're asking. Again, the problem is context. So if Jesus is telling people to turn the other cheek or go the extra mile, what's the original context? And I don't have it. So he could be talking about just village life and normal interactions between his hearers. He might have something in mind having to do with the Romans or the occupiers. Here is a place where I don't think you can settle settle this issue with regard to the historical Jesus. If you look at the history of interpretation or reception history, this passage is picked up by pacifists who read it a certain way, but it can also be read in a non-pacifistic sense, as it is in Calvin. So I don't know the original context for this, and so I can't tell you. I can tell you that there are similar sayings elsewhere with Greco-Roman moralists, and there are some similar sayings in Jewish tradition. But what exactly Jesus is doing with this, exactly would depend on the context. If you're talking about actually paying attention to this, though, the way Matthew intends it to be read, I think that he's trying to give these as examples of a general principle, and it's going to be up to the reader to figure out how to apply those. But how Jesus applied this, the principle that is there in some situation, I don't know. One thing that's interesting is that in the Passion narratives, he does look pretty passive. So what does that tell you? Is he actually living a philosophy here that is enunciated in Luke 6 and Matthew 5? Maybe. But, that's what you have way too often, is you have maybes.
So now I want to ask you about the reach of memory regarding Q, oral versus the written account.
Well, look, I know that human memory can be very capacious. I carry around lots of poems in my head. I have certain rituals that I perform regularly, and if I wrote them down on paper, they would go on for page after page after page. I recite them the same way every time. So human memory can be very good. But if you look at the Gospels, I do not see any sort of verbatim oral tradition. I mean, we've got 4 accounts of the Last Supper. None of them agree word for word. We have 3 accounts of the Lord's Prayer. They do not agree. We have 2 accounts of this material on turning the other cheek. And, Matthew and Luke, and they're not exactly the same. And then if you go outside the canon, look at the Didache and First Clement and Polycarp, none of them are repeating things word for word. So it's a funny sort of tradition, and I've never been able to get a hold of it exactly. It's like it's sort of memorized. There's no real concern with word for word repetition. Matthew and Luke can rewrite Mark. If there's a Q, Matthew and Luke are not reproducing it exactly. Sometimes it's really close, like in Matthew 3 and Luke 3 in the speech of John the Baptist. That's almost word for word for word. But there are other places where it isn't. So it's a very funny tradition. I don't know how to get a hold of it. People are always working on parallels, and these are important and they're things to think about. But I've never read the cross-cultural parallel that made me think, oh yeah, that's exactly what's going on here. It's not exactly what's going on in the rabbis. It's not exactly what's going on in Greek schools. It's not exactly what's going on with Homeric epics. I don't know. It's one of the things that's kept me interested in this field. I think there are memories here, but it's really hard to figure out how exactly things are being remembered. There's some kind of memorization here, but it's not word for word memorization. And later things can be added, and you can reinterpret things. So it's Paul talks about passing on tradition, and it is tradition when he does this in 1 Corinthians 15. and earlier in the discourse on the Lord's Supper. But it's just not word for word stuff. So I'm still looking for the right analogy. When I memorize stuff, it's always word for word. That's not what the first Christians are doing.
So now I want to ask you about your little experiment, looking at Jesus's death based on Paul's letters alone.
Oh, well, so that's in Constructing Jesus. And what I argued is that if you just had Paul's letters, and that if you wanted to play Sherlock Holmes, you could reconstruct a number of things about Jesus, assuming that Paul is correct, or at least you could assume, you could figure out what traditions he had. You could figure out that he had a Last Supper in which he supposedly said certain words. There's something about being handed over and betrayed. There's the use of certain psalms in Paul that have to do that overlap with what you find in Mark's Passion narrative. So what I did is I went through and I tried to figure out everything you could figure out from Paul if you were playing detective. I think if you were playing detective, you could say that he was that his execution had something to do with Jews, to look at First Thessalonians, but also the rulers and principalities of the world are involved, and I think those have to include the Romans. They can't just be immaterial powers and spirits. So I went through, and what I came up with was totally consistent with Mark's Passion narrative. So it was one of my reasons for thinking that there probably was a pre-Markan Passion narrative, and Paul may well have been acquainted with it. I also argue there, and have argued elsewhere, that this actually just fits human psychology. So in the modern world, the social psychologists tell us that when you have a tragic and violent end, and it was not exactly prepared for because it's tragic and violent, that memories tend to focus on the last few days or the last week of somebody's life, everything that leads up to the end. And it struck me once in reading some of this psychological work that this is what we have in early Christianity. We have this great emphasis on the last week. Everything is death, crucifixion, burial, resurrection. That's all, last week stuff. And then in the Gospels, you're all over the place until you get to the last week. And even John sort of lines up then. You get all these agreements. And it struck me, just makes sense if these traditions go back to people who were preoccupied with the last week of this person's life, because that's just what happens to memories. They latch in on everything that leads up to the death, and then the other memories are just are scattered and different. I don't know that I'm right about that, but it's been fun to think about.
Was there an expectation of divine vengeance within eschatology?
Sure, that's everywhere. I wish it weren't there, but it's everywhere. So heaven is always coupled with hell, so to speak. The righteous are always over against the wicked. Even in a passage I love, like the parable of the sheep and the goats, you take care of the prisoner and the people without clothes and the people who are needy. If you do that, you get in. If you don't do that, then you flunk the judgment. And I think this is more than rhetoric in Matthew, and I think it's more than rhetoric for Jesus. It's not just a way of saying, yeah, you really need to do this. I think they are presupposing that there are different fates in the world to come. Uh, this is all over Jewish eschatology. It's all over First Enoch. It's all over Fourth Ezra. It's all over Second Baruch. It's in the Apocalypse of Abraham. It's in the book of Daniel, Daniel 12. And of course the Hebrew Bible prophets, they're full of judgment. So there's no way around this. There have been occasional scholars and others who have tried to go through the Jesus tradition and sort of cut out everything that had to do with Gehenna and judgment and so on. The poet Shelley already did this. He's the first one I've ever found who did this. But it was done in the 19th century. It was done in the 20th century. I don't think that works as history. I think judgment is there. I think it's there for Jesus. I think it's there for the evangelists. I think it's there for the New Testament. But that's just because they're inheriting this from Judaism.
What is redaction criticism?
Redaction criticism had its heyday in the, I guess, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then it just became part of the discipline. So commentators regularly practice it now. Redaction criticism, primarily with the Gospels, is looking at how Matthew has treated Mark and how Luke has treated Mark, and then establishing patterns. So redaction criticism would observe, with regard to Matthew, for example, that he tends to cut Mark's stories, and he likes to get to the words of Jesus as soon as possible. Sometimes he cuts stories in half. And if you see something repeating over and over in Matthew as opposed to Mark, then you can understand his literary habit, but you also get some idea of his theology. If you put Matthew beside Mark, for example, another illustration, Jesus asks more questions in Mark than he does in Matthew. Matthew frequently rewrites a text in Mark so that Jesus isn't asking a question. Or sometimes Mark will say something like, Jesus healed many, and Matthew will turn that into Jesus healed all. So you can see these tendencies, which will reflect Christological ideas and other things. So redaction criticism primarily is looking at Luke against Mark and assuming that Luke is rewriting Mark or using Mark. What is he doing to Mark? How is he revising? And what does this tell us about him? And the same thing with Matthew. This started in Germany, I guess, in the 1950s, and then caught on everywhere else in the 60s and 70s. Some people look down on redaction criticism because they think of it as failing to recognize the final literary product, but there's no contradiction between looking at the final literary product and appreciating it for what it is, and then looking at the changes and figuring out what they reflect. So my own work, I do redaction criticism, but I'm also very interested in the final form, the literary form of the texts we have.
So my final question before we finish with the super chats: was the eschatology extensively revised and embellished over time?
So you'll have to repeat that again. I didn't hear the last half. I'm sorry. Was it revised
and embellished over time?
Was it? Well, look, everything's revised and embellished over time. The problem with me answering that is that while I've spent my life trying to do tradition histories and figure out the histories of texts and paragraphs and saints and so on, it's really hard to get knowledge, because so much is speculation. So if you want to ask, for example, does Matthew intensify eminent expectation? You could answer that yes, but I don't think it's any more eminent in Matthew than it was for Paul, or was for Jesus, or was for John. So of course, each evangelist or each early Christian is going to revise the tradition and going to adjust it. Luke himself does not have eminent expectation in the same way Matthew does. Luke has cooled off a little bit, I think, compared to Mark and to Matthew and compared to Q. So, of course, those things happen. Paul himself changes his mind a bit as things go on. As I said earlier, in Philippians, he now knows that he's going to die. I don't think he thinks that when he's writing First Thessalonians. Maybe even when he's writing First Corinthians, but he may think this by the time you get to Second Corinthians. So if you're reflective and if you're a thinker and you're somebody like Paul, who is a sort of intellectual, if you will, or Matthew, who's a sort of intellectual, or John, who's a sort of intellectual, they're going to look at these traditions, and of course they're going to revise them and make them fit what they're doing. But that's what all of us do with everything. So that's just what people do when they write texts.
All right, let's get back to the super chats. I fish and tie. Thank you for your super chat. Does the rainbow body fit with the Talpiot tomb?
Wow. Oh my, what a question. Talpiot tomb? I don't know how to answer that. Oh, gosh. So the rainbow body is the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, in which a master or a wise person dies, and then their body either shrinks completely, or it shrinks partly, or maybe it just leaves behind hair and fingernails. I suppose I'm being asked the question because I've written on this when trying to think about the resurrection of Jesus. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say here about the tomb. Other people can speak to that better. In my book on the resurrection, I did not accept that tomb as authentic. Other people who are knowledgeable disagree with me there, but I wouldn't know how to answer that. I think the rainbow body is really interesting for thinking about what happened in the first century, because if any of these stories are true, well, wow, that's incredible. If they're all false, that also tells us something about human beings and how legends get created and so on. In any case, I think the rainbow body phenomenon needs to be looked at more. I'm not an expert in it. I don't know any Tibetan languages and so on. I just know that it's an interesting thing. What it has to do with a particular tomb, I wouldn't know how to think about that.
Hi, Fisher Tai. Thank you for your super chat. Jesus' followers fled to Pella before the destruction of Jerusalem. This is attributed to Jesus's warning. Do you think those people thought he failed?
Well, so first of all, there's some debate as to whether the flight to Pella is historical. We find that in later ecclesiastical sources. It then gets read by some scholars into Mark 13. Joseph, there was a really important dissertation written on this, maybe in the 1980s or maybe it was 70s. Joseph Verheyden argued that this is a legend. I don't know whether it's a legend or not. I also don't know if people fled to Pella, who they were exactly or what they became. One view is that the Jewish Christians fled to Pella, and then they become the head of these Jewish Christians that you read about in the Church Fathers, or just Justin Martyr, Jerome, and so on. So I don't know how to. I don't know that I know that this happened, but if it did happen, I don't think we know what happened to those people. Again, if they fled Jerusalem and they thought the end would come and then it didn't, there's no reason to think from the study of millenarian movements that they would just give up. They might have reinterpreted their expectations, or they may have rationalized them away and said, oh, Jesus was going to come, but such and such happened. If they're a tight-knit group and they love each other and they find fulfillment in all sorts of other things in their their religious rituals and liturgics and so on, if they have many reasons to stay together, then the failure of a single prophecy isn't going to destroy what they have. So if some early Christians fled to Pella, they may well have simply continued. They may have been disappointed or surprised, but that may not have done anything to the movement.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Jehovah's Witnesses have everyone beat when it comes to failed expectations and surviving. Like 1914, they ruined many lives.
So I don't know what the reference to ruin many lives was, but I think they learned their lesson, by which I mean that, as far as I know, they don't do dates anymore, right? They just don't do dates. I'm not again, I don't know what they ruin many lives means. Maybe this is a reference to some disillusionment that I don't know about. But they did more than once pick a date, and they were wrong. But I think they've learned their lesson.
Apollos, Christian Apologetics, thank you for your super chat. I saw you endorse Tucker Ferda's historical critical work that the Second Coming Hope goes back to Jesus' words. Any additional thoughts on the Galilean crisis scenario where Jesus changed his mind?
Yeah, so Tucker and I have some disagreement here. That's a book that's very much worth reading. He's a really fine scholar. He's rightly making a name for himself. I think that there may have been something like a Galilean crisis. So earlier I talked about Jesus seeing at the end that he might die. But another possibility is that Jesus took seriously this Jewish notion of repentance, that Israel will repent before the end. That's all over the sources. And if Jesus believed that repentance should precede the end, and he thought that people had not responded properly to his message, he could have thought in terms of things changing. And maybe at that point, he begins to say, oh, I've got to go up to Jerusalem. And maybe then he begins to contemplate the possibility of opposition there and death. And so that he changes his mind. I do think one thing is clear. If the Gospels remember this rightly, if Q remembers rightly, you have these sayings about this generation, and you have some woes on cities in Galilee. And I don't see how, if Jesus uttered those, that they don't reflect disillusionment. And the disillusionment means you hope for something that didn't come to pass. So the question then becomes, does disappointment change anything in Jesus's expectation? And I think it well might. This goes back, as Tucker showed in his first book on the Galilean crisis. This is very popular in the 19th century, and it dies out in the first half of the 20th century pretty much. But it's still an idea worth thinking about. So that's my answer to that.
Apollos, Christian Apologetics, thank you for your super chat. As far as I understand it, Ferda endorses the Galilean crisis as more likely than mere apocalypticism, where Jesus hopes for a near eschaton, but eventually submits to the Father's will to die for the world.
Okay, leave that. Can you leave that up so I can
Yeah.
look at it for a second? Mere apocalypticism, where Jesus hopes for a near eschaton. Uh, so Tucker is really cautious about this Galilean crisis business. He does think that Jesus was disillusioned at some point, but unlike me, he's not thinking that Jesus changed his idea of eminence, which for Tucker wasn't my sense of eminence anyway. That is, again, he thinks Jesus will come in his own mind, or the Son of Man will come, things will wrap up within a generation. I think there's a more urgent expectation early on, so that I can associate uh, uh, a change in Jesus's mind with a putting off of things a bit down the road. Tucker doesn't have to do that because of his different reading of the tradition.
Grace 174, thank you for your super chat. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not. Your comment on Matthew 24 says that it shows Jesus' words take eternal authority of God above Torah. Do you think Jesus gave his predictions with this authority?
Okay, let me look at this again.
Mhm.
My commentary says Jesus' shows Jesus's words take eternal authority of God above. Well, I don't remember that comment. Maybe I did say this, but I don't see how Jesus could put his own view above God or God's words. If he thought God spoke something, then God spoke something, and that would be true. In Jesus's own mind, he can qualify, I think, Torah because of the eschatological crisis, but I don't think of him as putting his take eternal authority of God above Torah. I think Jesus thought of himself as a messianic figure, messianic deliverer, as a messianic prophet. And there are Jewish texts in which you do what the prophet says, even if he tells you to disobey Torah. You can find that in Sifrei Deuteronomy, for example. Jesus may have operated like that, but if I'm interpreting this correctly, I don't know that Jesus could set his authority, or yeah, I must be misunderstanding the question here. Maybe you're just asking if Jesus could set his authority above Torah. I think he could qualify Torah for the sake, again, of his eschatological context. That's how I would put it. I don't think, though, that he's an antinomian. The social memory of the Gospels is that every time Jesus was accused of breaking a law or something, he was always going back to Scripture to justify what he is doing. I take that to be a proper memory. That is, when people objected to Jesus doing this or that, he didn't say, "Oh yeah, you're right. Forget Moses. Who cares about that anymore?" That's not how he was operating. He was doing something else.
Grace 174, thank you for your super chat. Do you have any takes on the origins of Jesus saying in Papias about the eschatological grape, similar to 2 Baruch 29:5?
Yeah, well, look, so I have no idea about this, where it comes from, whether Jesus could have ever said this or used it. Maybe so. But look, we don't have the context for this. Papias's works are gone. We just have stuff preserved. Yes, this passage does have it's attributed to Papias. Also has a very close parallel in Second Baruch. By the way, maybe not everyone in the audience knows, this is a wonderful story about how big grapes will be in the world to come. And in one version of this, you have a grape that's so big, it'll take a whole wagon to take one grape. And if you want wine, you'll just stick a spigot into this giant grape and it'll come out. And that's what the world to come will be like. Whether Jesus ever use that sort of concrete imagery. I don't know. If he had used it, would he have meant it literally? I don't know. Uh, so again, I have to confess ignorance here.
So we have 2 more super chats left before we close, and I'm letting everybody know right now these will be the last 2 super chats I take before we close. Magi Mike, thank you for your super chat. Recently, there has been proposals that the Gospels mentioning doubt of followers, hints that not all apostles believed in the resurrection. Thoughts?
Oh, that's a good question. Acts has them all, gathered together at the beginning, but then they go away. Most of them go away, and you can't. We don't know anything about Thaddeus and over half of the 12. All we have are later legends, and I have never been convinced that any of those have real memory in them. The motif of doubt is in John 21. It's in Matthew 28. It's in the longer ending of Mark. We've got some of that reflected also in Luke, and there's also the failure to recognize Jesus. So I would say that if you were to read just Matthew says Jesus appeared and some doubted. He doesn't say anything about the resolution of that doubt. And it's you can generate any number of scenes. Maybe everybody went along for a while and some of them went back to Galilee at some point. I don't think you would know. I don't think the sources would tell you that. The sources say that, Peter, James, and John, among the 12, they were active in the post-Easter period. Maybe the rest of them were also. But you just have to be honest here and say that, apart from Acts 1 having everybody together, you just don't know anything about those folks. So you can speculate. It's kind of fun to speculate. I have occasionally speculated that maybe a couple of them just gave up at some point, maybe 5 years in, and went back to Galilee. But it's all speculation, and the tradition, for what it's worth, does have all of them as martyrs and dying and so on. Maybe it's not worth anything, but maybe that's apologetical memory. I would guess it is, but I hate to sound like a refrain here, but I don't know. What I am pretty sure of is that I don't think this motif, which occurs throughout the stories, I don't think it's an invention. I think some people weren't sure what was going on and made their doubts or their questions clear. And this motif of doubt, I think, that takes the form of a story in John 21 with the doubting Thomas. I think that's a development, a story version of this motif of doubt that's there in the tradition, and I don't see any reason for it to have been made up. So at least that, I think, is historical.
Didymus, thank you for your super chat. Would Paul have believed that flesh would transform into the pneuma during resurrection, or would the flesh be left behind?
I'm inclined to read Paul as though he thinks that whatever is left in the grave, some part of it's going to be transformed. 1 Corinthians 15 does not read to me like the result of 10 years reflection. It reads to me like a response to a question or to a problem that Paul sees. And I personally think the most likely thing is that he's responding to people who don't have any trouble with Jesus rising from the dead, because he's buried and then he goes. So, you don't have the problem of rotting flesh and skeletons and so on. And I think at some point these Corinthians are thinking, yeah, well, Jesus rose from the dead. That's not a problem. But to think that corpses are going to come back to life, that makes no sense. And Paul's committed to the idea of resurrection. He's a Pharisee. That's his Christian tradition. But he wants, as much as possible, to stress the discontinuity between what's buried and what is resurrected. I think myself it's something like transformation or transubstantiation. He says at the end that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God against the dominant Christian interpretive and apologetical tradition. I think he means that. So I think he means that flesh and blood becomes something else. I don't think he's just talking about sinful human nature there. I think he's talking about flesh and blood. So I think he's envisaging a radical transformation. And then when Origen comes along later and tries to minimize the idea of physical continuity, I think he's probably reflecting the spirit of Paul.
So despite what I said a second ago, we do have 4 more super chats, but I think a couple of them are potentially off topic. I'll leave it up to you if you have any more time.
Well, how about one more? Okay.
Okay. All right, Didymus, thank you for your super chat. Have the criteria of authenticity been discarded?
No. So there are a number of us who think that they need to be used less and that they don't deliver on their promises. But there are lots of people in the guild who think we're wrong and who are still using them. So I think it's fair to say that there's an ongoing debate in the guild. I'm on the side who thinks that they are of only very limited value. I have a whole chapter on this in my new book on alternatives to the criteria and what use they might be, right? But there are others who think I'm too skeptical about these tools and that we should still be using them, maybe refine them a bit, take into account some of the criticism, but they can still be used. So it wouldn't be fair at this point to say scholars think we're right in the middle of a debate that's ongoing and quite interesting. I'm on the skeptical side, but there are lots of people on the other side.
So I just want to remind everybody that the link to Constructing Jesus is in the description below, and it will be in the pinned comment below, including a link to his course with Derek from the Efficient Podcast. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Dale Allison.
Thank you. Happy to be here and answer the questions as best I can.
Thank you again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.